Good evening, members, ladies and gentlemen. Members, can I just remind you that as we are now having live meetings, we need to make sure everybody speaks with the microphone turned on. So, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this evening's meeting of the Community Committee. I'm Councillor Sally Derham-Wilkes, and I'm the chairman of the committee. Members and officers have their names in front of them for ease of reference. In order to assist this evening, I must ask everyone to ensure that their mobile phones are either switched off or on silent modes. We would be grateful if you would remain quiet whilst the meeting is in progress. I would like to remind everyone present that this meeting will be filmed by the Council and broadcast live on the internet and will be capable of repeated viewing. If you're settled in the chamber, it's possible that the cameras will capture your image. By your presence, you are deemed to have consent to be filmed and to the use of those images and sound recordings for webcasting and for training purposes. As the chairman of the meeting, I can, at my discretion, terminate or suspend the filming if, in my opinion, according to do so would prejudice the proceedings of the meeting, or if I consider that continued filming might infringe the rights of any individual by breach of any statutory provision. Finally, there are no planned fire drills for this evening. If the fire alarm sounds, please evacuate the building immediately via the emergency exits. Right, thank you for that. We'll move on to the agenda now. Can I ask the officer for any apologies he might have received, please?
I haven't received any apologies, Chairman. I'm just wondering if the other members have got apologies to submit on their behalf.
David, I've spotted you first, sir.
Thank you, Chairman. Apologies from Mr Mayor, Councillor Nick Geary.
Thank you. Claire?
Yes, apologies from Councillor Sue Spittle and Tavis Fox.
Okay, declarations of interest, members? Anybody any interest to declare? No. Right, we'll now move on then to the minutes of the previous meeting. You've all had the minutes. Has anybody got any questions on them? Claire?
Yes, thank you, Chairman. In item 110, Highcliffe Zigzag Path, I felt it should be appropriate that it be noted that a member asked officers if the data received from ACOM could be used to get alternative proposals from other companies, and we were advised that due to copyright issues this was not possible, and I felt that that should be reflected in the minutes.
You can deal with it. Okay, thank you very much. Anything else, anybody? You're all happy then to receive these minutes? Right. Thank you, Colin. Yeah. Thank you, Claire. Right, we are going to now move to item number 5, the review of the dog fouling investigation and enforcement policy. If I could ask, please, Sean to come to the table and start when you're ready.
Thank you, Chairman. Good evening, members. Yes, this is a report on the draft, as it is at the moment, dog fouling and investigation policy. The policy, as proposed, is set out in Appendix 1 of the report. Appendix 2 shows the sort of originating document with the track changes that are in it. So you can see where the where the document has actually derived from. It can be a bit confusing if you don't know track changes, but essentially what it's showing are items that have been added, which are underlined, and then items which have been deleted, which are crossed out. The different colours simply indicate that different officers have had an input into that process. But as I say, unless there's something specific in that document, I would focus on Appendix 1, which is really the version that we are asking you to adopt as the policy that we will work under. Just going through the report in brief, there was a previous audit carried out on the service, and the recommendation of that was that some changes should be made to reflect more accurately the operational procedures that were taking place. And there was also an opportunity at that point to incorporate some changes in legislation that are coming up. The original document was more of a procedural document, and so we've also taken the opportunity to take out some of those more officer instructions and really leave it as a policy document, so that we can, once adopted, publish it on the website, and members of the public then have an understanding of the service and how it will be delivered. Briefly then, running through Appendix 1, the policy sets out our response to complaints about dog fouling, whether those are the general complaints and that section, or whether there are specific complaints which are more about an individual. The policy also sets out how we will proactively go out and patrol and take enforcement action should breaches be identified, and it also sets out what we will do where persons refuse to give their name and address. It also sets out how we will deal with offences based upon the evidence that we get, and how we will deal with the non-payment of fixed penalty notices. It does set out in the report, not in the appendix, but in the report, the fact that there are two amounts effectively for paying fixed penalty notice, as is often common practice nowadays, and the current amounts for fixed penalty notices are £75, but that's reduced to £50 if it is paid within the first 7 days. Should the matter end up going to court, either for because of non-payment, or because it is felt that either because it's not the first time that we've issued a fixed penalty, or for some other reason, then in court the maximum fine on conviction is £1,000. I would just highlight briefly as well the current regime operates under dog control orders. Part of when I mentioned about the legislative changes that are taking place, dog control orders are transferring to a new regime, which you may well have heard of before, public space protection orders. That will take place from October the 20th. Now, the only change there is that members previously decided that under the public space protection order regime, the fixed penalty notices that would apply, the full amount would be £100, and the amount for early payment would be £75. So that will change when the regime changes on the 20th of October. The court fine remains at the same amount at £1,000. The policy also touches briefly on appeals, and whilst there's no statutory appeal process, the policy sets out a procedure to review cases where, following the issue of the fixed penalty notice, the recipient wants to challenge the issue of that notice, and it would seem sensible that we at least listen to those challenges rather than proceed to court and then discover something on a technical matter which meant that we could have withdrawn or dealt with the matter without everybody wasting time and money by proceeding through the courts. And that's set out in the report, and there is a pro forma that will be filled out to record the appeal process and the decision that's made on that. So that's all I was proposing to say, but obviously happy to take any questions that members may have.
Thank you for that, Sean. Questions? Yes, Trish?
Thank you, Chairman. Only one quick one. Do you have enough staff or officers to police this?
The answer is probably no, but what we try and do with the resource that we've got is to either target areas where we're getting complaints. We do, as I say, do proactive patrols, raise, so that people are aware. And actually, the vast majority of the dog walkers are actually obviously very good at self-policing, and they will provide us with some information as to perhaps where we need to target our efforts, should that be the case, because obviously those responsible ones don't want to be blamed for, I have to say, what is now the occasional issues with dog fouling. But I think people's tolerance of dog fouling is now far less, and the complaints that we do get about areas, often there isn't as it used to be in the past, there isn't an obvious problem dotted across the area. It is often that there are just one or two isolated incidents, but it's good that that is the level that people are notifying us about, so we can get in early and try to deal with it.
Thank you, Sean. Claire and then Colin, followed by John.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I just wanted to ask if you can give us an idea of how many prosecutions we have generally, or penalty notices that are issued each year, and whether we could have an annual summary of that come to this committee, just so that we're aware of how good we are at catching people.
Yes, in the recent past, we've issued, well, it's a combination of things. We tend on average to get between sort of 50 and 100 complaints a year from members of the public. We have, in 15-16, we issued 5 fixed penalties. Since then, we haven't issued any. There have been, obviously, not difficulties, but I think because people are now more aware of the fact that they can receive a fixed penalty, the dog wardens don't undertake covert patrols because it causes obviously issues with sort of ripper surveillance. So they are overt, they do go in sort of visibly, and obviously people do then at that point will pick up after them. But it's partly educational, partly enforcement orientated. I wouldn't necessarily want members to think that the number of fixed penalty notices issued is indicative of how successful the patrolling is, because I think that would perhaps mask the educational side and the sort of letting people know that dog wardens are there, they do patrol, and obviously they should be picking up after their dogs anyway.
Thank you for that, Sean. It strikes me by what you've said that we've done a good job of educating people over a considerable number of years, so I'm very pleased to hear that. Colin?
Thank you, Chairman. Bearing in mind what you said earlier, that staffing levels are somewhat stretched, are our officers also tasked with patrolling the beach areas? Because the reason I ask this is that during the summer months, down at, for instance, Friars Cliff, we've got dogs on lead only ban, and on numerous occasions during the past summer, there were dogs running about not on leads. Whether people just weren't aware of the signs or whether they were ignoring the signs, I don't know. But there was no one there to enforce it other than local residents who did sort of, in no uncertain terms, inform people that their dogs should be on leads. But are our officers tasked with that area as well?
Yes, they do patrol along the beaches. It is, as you say, quite a distance, and that with some of the other areas. We are looking as part of the transfer to the public space protection order regime. What we are looking at doing next year is actually talking to the Countryside and Open Spaces team leader to look at authorising some of the beach staff, the seasonal beach staff as well, to actually be able to, if necessary, issue fixed penalties, but also just to offer a quick training session to basically say, this is what the requirements are, this is where they apply, and please do go and speak to members of the public, especially those who are not complying, and just again educate them on what they can and cannot do.
Thank you, both of you. John and then Vicky.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Having spent a few minutes just before the start of this meeting trying to read where we've got to in the way that it is printed as coming to this community committee, and bearing in mind that this will either go to additionally to P&R or definitely on to the full council. Full council.
The minutes come to full council, but we won't be discussing the details of this. I look at the officers for clarification. No, the decision is making process is here.
Trying to say to somebody coming to it for the first time, like some of our people might be at the full council, I think the document is just about unreadable. Could, before it comes to the full council, a cleaned up version of what it is that we've got to actually be printed, either in addition to or instead of the document, so that people come to it, and perhaps even some of us who've been looking at it for far too long got a chance of actually reading the finished document, which is the end of the work we've been doing. Thank you.
John, the minutes of this meeting come to the council.
Yeah.
We don't have the whole of the agenda coming to the council. Sorry?
It's a decision item.
Yes.
Chairman, so.
We make the decision here based on what we have before us.
Yeah. So just to clarify, is that I assume Councillor Lofts is referring to the track changes appendix, which I agree is somewhat confusing. However, Appendix 1, which starts on page 33, is effectively that cleaned up version of the document with the track changes. So just looking at Appendix 1, as I say, which runs from page 33 to page 37, that is the as-is cleaned up final version that's proposed for you to adopt today. After today, that is the document.
Thank you, John. Vicky.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Excuse my voice, I'm losing it. Obviously, we've got the dog fouling, but there are unfortunately a number of people that walk their dogs that do clean up, However, then they go and sling the poo bag into the bushes. And I was just wondering whether this actually captures those people as well, because that was obviously as bad as leaving it, or if not worse, and more dangerous. So that was my question.
The short answer is no. This policy doesn't cover deal with that particular aspect of it, but that would be able to be picked up as littering. I mean, it's a subtle difference, but the offence of dog fouling is not picking up forthwith. So once you have picked up the dog fouling forthwith, then you've sort of complied with that requirement. If you then, as you say, hang it on a branch, which is unfortunately often what happens, or throw it into the hedge, then that could be dealt with under the littering provisions. So, and that's obviously a separate matter, but it can be dealt with.
Thank you.
David.
Dare I, Chairman? Would it be possible for the officer to give us an idea of what the fines are for littering, as opposed to what we've got in front of us this evening? Thank you, Madam Chair.
I stand to be corrected, but I believe from memory the fixed penalty amounts are the same as for the dog fouling. There may be a slight difference. I would have to go away and double check that, but we're talking in the same ballpark certainly as the fixed penalties for dog fouling.
Thank you both for that. I have nobody else indicating with a question, so we'll move to the debate. Trish?
Thank you, Chairman. I'm happy, as being a responsible dog owner and dog walker, I'm very happy to propose this as set out. There are always going to be people who aren't responsible, and there's always going to be accidents. I can remember one day walking up with the dog, and I always keep a close eye on him until he's done his business. I won't go into great detail about it, but and this one day, it's not behind me, and I looked behind, and he was doing what he should be doing in front of me. So I went back, and fortunately I was very lucky because there were two wardens coming down the other way after and I thought, my goodness, if I hadn't turned around at that time I might have been caught, which would have been very embarrassing. Most people, I think, are responsible. I had arrived walking the dog and found I haven't got any bags with me, and there's always somebody around with a bag that they'll give you. I've given bags to other people who've said they can't find them. So, but it is something that we have got to watch. I think it is getting better. There was a terrible time, I think, when the forest was closed for dog walking, and it was awful everywhere, but it is improving, and I think we've just got to keep on and make sure everybody is responsible. Happy to propose as set out.
Thank you, Chairman. Vicky.
Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Sorry. It's okay. Promoted you.
All right,
Sorry.
I'm very happy to second, again, as a responsible dog owner. I'm very happy to see this imposed, and hopefully we can try and clean up our dog walking areas and our pavements.
I haven't seen anybody else indicated to speak. Is there anyone before we move to the vote? Right, those in favour of the recommendation that we adopt this policy?
It's unanimous, Chairman.
Unanimous. Excellent. Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Sean, for bringing this to us tonight, and all the work that's gone into it to achieve this by all the different coloured people in their write-ups. Right, we can now go back to item number 4, which is the Community Housing Fund grant budget and criteria, and welcome Bryony Stevens to the table. can I just remind you that we need to use the speaker when you're talking now, because we are being televised. Thank you.
Okay, so what I'm bringing before you today is a budget for our expenditure of our allocation from the government of what's called the Community Housing Fund, and a proposal to use some of that some of that allocation for a grant fund for community housing groups. So just to give you some background, this Community Housing Fund money was paid to us by the government earlier this year, although actually the first allocation we've had applies to the year 16-17. So we will be getting another payment soon. We believe that the funding will continue for 4 years, but actually it's proving quite difficult to get further clarity about that from DCLG. The purpose of the funding is, as stated by government, to encourage community-led development of housing on sites that wouldn't be of interest to large-scale private housing developers. It can be used for a range of purposes, including capital investment, technical and community support, training for community groups, capacity building, supporting particularly for community land trusts, and also could be used for other forms of community-led housing such as gypsy and traveller sites, self-build schemes and co-housing schemes. And just to give you a little bit of background on the community land trust issue, generally speaking, community land trusts have been used in rural areas where there is what we call an exception site. So it's a site that wouldn't normally be used for housing, and the development is only allowed because it's affordable housing, and that affordable housing has to be supported by the community, and the need for that housing has to be demonstrated by a housing needs survey. And we do have an example of that in East Dorset. We don't currently have any community housing projects or community land trusts in Christchurch. The funding was the amount of funding that we've been given is based on a formula that government used to calculate how much we got based on the number of second homes in an area and local affordability. And I think that's why Christchurch got quite a large allocation compared to East Dorset. It must be something to do with the numbers of second homes, perhaps because it's on the coast. So the proposal, one aspect of the budget that we've proposed is to employ another housing enabling officer to help to generate the community housing activity that we will need in order to be able to make use of this funding. And the reason that this is before you today is around the Community Housing Fund grant. In common with other councils who've been awarded this allocation, we're seeking to provide a grant fund that community groups or individuals involved in community housing groups can apply to for a range of purposes. And you'll see attached to the paper the draft budget and also quite detailed guidance notes for applicants for the grants, the form and so on, and the terms and conditions. And I should say that I haven't written or come up with all of that detail. Some of that was provided by a support group called the Wessex Community Assets, and so this will be similar in nature to probably what other councils will adopt, although I have tweaked it a bit to fit our particular circumstances. And what I've also asked that you be supplied with, because I thought it might help you to see where this is all coming from, is the letter we received from DCLG. So this is the additional piece of information which just outlines our allocation of the Community Housing Fund, gives a list of what all the different authorities have had, and you'll see there's a huge variation, and that it isn't, although the original idea of this type of housing development has come very much from a rural setting, the funding has gone to councils, rural and urban. It hasn't just been for rural authorities. And then there's a bit more detail at the end about how the government sees community-led housing, and you'll see that it's actually quite broad ranging in terms of what we we can use this funding for. So I think that's all I was intended to say, but quite happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Bryony. We'll start with questions, and Margaret's indicated, and Colin. Margaret.
Thank you. On page 13, you've got the proposed expenditure.
Yes.
On the right-hand side, it says, on the second one down, there's a proposal pending for 10-unit scheme in CC, site privately owned, and CBC could fund servicing plots. What area is that? Do you happen to know?
Well, that since I originally drafted that hasn't. But we have been approached by a local developer who is interested in supporting a South Build group. So this is specifically for South Build, and I think what he's got in mind is to try and assist people who could afford the lower end of owner occupation, but by doing the South Build, it would make it, and by being involved in the development themselves, doing some of the labour, that it would be a cheaper way into home ownership. We haven't got a particular site. His interest was particularly around Highcliffe, but we would, if we were to pursue that, we would want to not really just kind of respond to him, but to, with our community housing enabling officer that we're currently advertising for, to more go out and look and see what the demand is. We now have also, we have to keep a register of people who want to pursue South Build opportunities, so we would go initially to those people we've got on our register in Christchurch. So there isn't a particular site in mind there at the moment.
Just follow that up.
Yeah.
Is that okay? So actually developers can put forward for this funding then, because I thought it was for like individuals for self-build or for community trusts or community groups. I wasn't aware that developers could do that.
No, it wouldn't be, you're quite right there, we wouldn't be aiming to give this funding over to the developer, except if he's genuinely, and it may not be him, but if there is interest in a South Build scheme in Christchurch from members of the community, then the funding would be used to support those people to gain access to training, to help them learn how to do the development, and it would also be used to service the site. So that's helping to take them through the planning process and helping with connections to services, that kind of thing. So we wouldn't be thinking that the funding would go to the developer, but to the project. And if he was involved in the project indirectly, yeah.
Thank you for explaining that. Colin and then Claire.
Thank you, Chairman. Of looking at the letter that's attached to the supplementary information we had today, it would seem to indicate that we have to go back to the government and tell them how we've spent the money and what we spent it on. Now, that seems to indicate to me that if we don't fulfil their requirements, that funding may well be withdrawn in future years for Christchurch, which would be a shame. And I'm a little concerned that we seem to be on a very tight time frame. This is 2016, 2017. We haven't got that long left in 2017, and at the moment we haven't, as I can see, really spent anything.
Yeah, you're quite right. And I mean, the problem is the money was announced that it applies to that 16-17 financial year, but they announced it in the end of December. We got the first payment in January and the second payment in March. So I think government has to have some understanding about the way that that's been allocated, the timing there. I mean, I've not shown any expenditure against this, but you're quite right. We've spent very little. What we've advertised once already for the enabling officer, and weren't able to appoint, and we've taken that job back to job evaluation, so that we're advertising again now at a higher salary. and that post really is critical to taking forward some of the other things. So yes, particularly in Christchurch, it's challenging because of, you know, there aren't any groups, and to develop a community group takes time. It's not something that's just going to happen immediately. We could look at ways in which we've also spent our financial contribution to the Wessex Community Assets. That's currently happening. So we have made some expenditure, but it's minimal against what we've been allocated so far.
Thank you both. Claire?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. It says that the fund is likely to be used on sites that are of little interest to mainstream developers. As part of the work that we're doing, are we going to create a list of those sites that we feel could be appropriate in our area for such self-build or whatever?
Yeah. I mean, the reality in Christchurch is probably not many sites that aren't of interest to developers because it's such a high value area. But what we are doing independently of this, but it will link nicely into this, we're currently carrying out an asset optimisation exercise where we're looking at all our council owned sites. And so we will be looking to see whether any of those would work for some form of community housing development or self-build, yes. And the funding may be, you know, that could be very useful in the sense that, of course, to dispose of a site, the council would have to think about best value and so on. So potentially perhaps this funding can help in that situation.
Thank you. John?
We will be able to
Your microphone, please, John.
we will be able to reply to government within the timescale required with any outstanding questions that are involved with the paperwork that's come to us for this meeting.
Sorry, John, would you clarify that a bit for the officer?
I don't want to go through all the paperwork, but there are some questions that have come from government, and there is a date in there, as I read it, when we had to reply, and I thought you mentioned it in your introduction.
When the money was first allocated in January,
Yes.
we had to respond to a series of questions about how
Yes.
we intended to spend the money, and in order to receive our next tranche of funding in March, which we did.
Yeah.
I'm not aware at the moment of a particular deadline or point at which we have to report again. I have contacted DCRG twice recently seeking clarification on the funding because we're recruiting a worker, and obviously we would like to know more about, and I get the impression they're possibly reviewing. I don't know how it's going to work.
So there is nothing outstanding in our replies.
No, we've responded
that's
to
I
what
was
we've been asked to
trying
do.
clarify.
Yes,
Thank
we've
you.
responded.
Right, it's myself, not you.
Thank you, John. But perhaps we could clarify things in as much as page 13 has the proposed expenditure. So I assume that is what you have or will be telling the government.
Yeah, that's what we told them. It is slightly different now in that we then decided we became aware that other councils were adopting a grant fund, and so I rejigged the budget slightly to identify that as a separate item. But yeah, that's basically what we told government.
Thank you very much for that. I have a question now, though, in view of something you said a little earlier on. What advertising or promotion will we be doing to our members of the community. Sorry, members of.
I mean, I was hoping we'd have the other officer in place to start the ball rolling. We will. I would suggest that that we would come and talk to ward members. We would perhaps want to talk to you about what other community groups you're aware of, or direct us towards where we might find interest in this. We might also promote to parish councils, town councils. In East Dorset, where we have more community housing activity, the parish councils have been instrumental in taking forward housing needs surveys. I think it would be, we want publicity for this when we've got the fund agreed and the worker in place.
Are you saying it's too soon to promote this now? I mean, following our meeting, will there be a press release going out, or what will happen?
I hadn't intended to put a press release out following this meeting, but yes, we could do that. I've been really kind of working on the point that I need to get permission for this. We're shortlisting for the post next week. I would prefer to advertise once we have the worker in place, because I don't want inquiries that we don't have the capacity to deal with. So my preferred approach would be to advertise that we're supporting community housing projects and there is a grant fund available. But my thinking is that you would need to do more work with those groups before they're ready to apply for a grant. Put it that way.
Yes, I think we all understand, but they need to know that the possibility is out there before they can come to you in the first place.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Colin?
Chairman, my concern is that, all right, we have a short list of appointees. Interviews got to be carried out. If an appointment is made, we then have to find out whether they will accept that appointment. Then they have to hand notice in. We're talking sort of maybe 3-4 months down the line, and if they work for certain people, they could be 6 months down the line before we actually appoint anyone in post, and that means time is dragging on before we have to sort of justify what's happening to central government.
Thank you, Colin. I'm sure our officers will try to make sure everything's progressed as quickly as possible, and we will have members, particularly Claire, as far as housing is concerned, keeping a watching brief on this on behalf of all the members. So thank you, Claire, for taking on that role. Right, any more questions? No, right, let's move to the debate then.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I think the Community Housing Fund grant is a very good scheme, and we're fortunate because we do have secured quite a large chunk of money from central government to support this in our area. You've obviously highlighted that it's not going to be the easiest scheme to actually move forward in our area, but I do think that we should rise to the challenge and put the message out as well and as widely as possible to our community, because there may well be organisations that we're not aware of who have schemes that they could use this fund for. And certainly affordability of homes in our area is a priority for our council, because it not only provides the homes for local people that we're all trying to achieve, but also it stimulates economic growth for the area, which has the knock-on effect for everybody. And certainly a lot of local businesses, when I was going around, highlighted the fact that finding people to recruit was very much linked to affordability of homes in our area. So I think this is a very good initiative, and I think the paper has clearly set out how we're progressing with it. and I hope that we get somebody in post that can move it forward apace, and try to secure some interest within the local community. But I do feel that identifying parcels of land and identifying groups is the role that perhaps our council should be quite heavily involved in, to make it easier for community groups to actually see that this might be a possibility for them. So I'm very happy to propose as set out, and propose that the funding goes ahead as you suggested.
Thank you for that, Claire. Margaret?
Yeah, I agree. This is something we should progress, and I'm happy to second the proposal.
Thanks, Margaret. Anybody else for any part of the debate, or have you worked out all the answers to the questions? Right, we'll move to the vote. Those in favour then, please.
It's unanimous, Chairman.
Thank you for that. Right, Bryony, thank you very much for coming and explaining that to us tonight. I think it's very nice that our government is putting some money our way for us to be able to use. I'm sure we, with your help and the help of a new officer, we will make the most of it. Thank you. Right, we're on item 8 now, members.
6.
Oh, sorry, 6. I won't finish the meeting that soon. Item 6. We have, I think, 2 very good examples of reports coming back on behalf of councillors from meetings or outside bodies they've been to representing this council. The first one, David, our leader, he went to the Christchurch Health and Wellbeing Executive Group. And members, you have the draft minutes here before you. David, is there anything you would like to add to this, please?
Thank you, Chairman. Only to note that that it was a shame that we've lost our representative on the Alzheimer's Society, as the Alzheimer's Society are withdrawing their funding, and I'm not quite sure. I'm guessing that it will be the mainstream Alzheimer's Society that will be looking after the information in terms of GPs units. But other than that, it's basically as set out in the minutes, Madam Chairman. And whilst I did forward the information for ward budgets and the criteria under which members of the public could apply, I don't believe anybody's actually come forward yet. So, but we'll wait and see. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Has anybody any questions for David on the minutes we have in front of us, or any comments about them? Anything in here that they'd like to particularly point out that they're pleased with?
I just think it highlights what amazing schemes are going on within our community, all to do with health and well-being, and how widely we're approaching this subject, which is has the health benefits for all our community. So I'd like to thank all those involved, both volunteers and officers who are involved in it, and David for obviously giving us a good summary of it, because I think with this initiative we are actually improving the health of our area, and hopefully preventing people from ending up with illnesses that are prevented by actually living healthy lifestyles. So I think congratulations to all involved.
Thanks for that, Claire. Vicky?
Thank you. I just really wanted to sort of reiterate really what Claire said. Yeah, there's some great worthwhile projects going on here. But in particular, I think there's close to several of our hearts. We're all from Highcliffe. There's probably about 4 of us around the table. In particular, the community garden project, which stands out in the report to me. so which is excellent. Very excited to see that move forward.
Thank you, Vicky. Right, everybody seems to have their say on that. David, thank you again for getting these minutes to us and giving us the opportunity to go through them. Another very good report back. Margaret and Trish go to the DWP meeting, and you have before you that report. Margaret, I believe you're going to just lead on this.
I can do. I think the highlight is yet again at the moment there's a predicted underspend, because last year there wasn't at the end of. Sorry,
You better start that again, Margaret, so that
Did-
everybody outside
failed. I tell everybody else to use the microphone and they didn't. Yeah. So the highlight is there is a predicted underspend at the moment. We're hoping that won't change by year end, which is April, but it's looking good at the moment. Yet again, I mean, there was an underspend last year and we did get some money back, and there was money put into the budget equalisation reserve as well last year. So that's good news at the moment. The rest of it, I think, is pretty self-explanatory, but I have put on the back some infographics, and I have to say Dorset Waste Partnership do like their infographics, but it does give you an indication of where the underspend Appendix 4 has come from. And then if you just go over the page, you've got the Q1 performance with the targets. You see the little arrows and what the targets were and how far they are at the moment towards the targets at this point in time. I'm happy to take any questions, but I think I really took the highlights from what went on at the meeting. As Trish will, I'm sure, agree with me, they are very long and very complicated meetings. The minutes weren't available when I wrote this, so basically all I've done is taken the highlights from each item that was discussed. And you'll see there's also the formation of the Strategic Waste Partnership Board, which is quite interesting because Bournemouth, who were the lead on this, did put forward to government for a grant, and they got around 14 million to build a waste transfer station. But when the tenders for it were received, they were not, it wasn't viable, quite frankly, so that didn't go forward, and they still have left over 12.9 million, which they want to try and do something with. So there are proposals for that, and they've put together the Strategic Waste Partnership Board to try and take those proposals forward. I'll leave it at that, I think. So.
Thank you. And yes, Trish.
Just a quickie, Madam Chairman. Since this meeting, we've been to a budget workshop, which was last week. Margaret wasn't able to go to that, I believe, which was very useful. The budget is not being prepared at the moment because their year isn't the same as our fiscal year. But it was quite useful, and all these sort of things came up, and there was some argument about whether the budget should be increased because of the savings made this year and last year, or possible savings this year and savings last year, or whether the budget should be increased. So, but watch this space.
Thank you, Trish. Claire?
I don't know if it's me, but I find this green thing quite difficult to interpret. In that sort of like the arrow at the top with a sort of on the top left. Is that what it was? And then
No, that's the target. That's why
the
it's got an
target.
arrow into the centre of the dartboard, so to speak.
Oh, that's the
That's
target.
the target. The target is 234 kilograms.
Right.
Waste arisings, I think that's per household or whatever it is. And where they are at the moment is 243. So they're doing quite well there, I think.
Okay. Right. I see now. So well, actually, it's really, I think the amount of waste recycled is really encouraging, isn't it? 61%. It's fantastic. So yeah, brilliant. Good. I understand it now.
I'll confess I had to look at it for a while, and I'd had an earlier copy before this came out. But yes, I think it's very good, and it's colour coded, the green, amber and red, in the way that we've done a lot of our work over the past years. So yes, the only red ones are the enforcement actions taken, the number of?
I can tell you a bit
And I
about that.
couldn't
if you like.
understand that. Yes, please.
All right. They're in the process of recruiting some additional enforcement officers, specifically as well. This is to do with fly tipping, mainly. Therefore, there hasn't been a lot of enforcement. They're doing their best, but they are recruiting extra staff to deal with that. And there's also a programme of the possibility of some cameras being put up. And I have put forward Amberley Lane, which I know has been a major fly tipping spot in Christchurch as one of the possible sites, whether we will get a camera, but I've suggested that. So that's why I know at the moment that is in the red, so to speak. Okay, and I would expect that the formal complaints on 19 might reflect that as well, because of the enforcement, lack of enforcement officer at the moment.
Thank you very much. Any questions? No? Right. Well, thank you both for that. Once again, it's well presented and makes it very sensible for us to read. Could I just ask Margaret something that isn't in here, but if she doesn't mind, just very briefly to tell us where we are with herbaceous planting, please?
Yes. You did have an email come out because Sally and our Premier specifically asked that one was sent out to members. You will recall that last year we started with 2 roundabouts, one at Milestone at one end of the borough and one at Jumpers at the other end of the borough, where we put herbaceous planting on there, so that hopefully the aim is that the maintenance of these roundabouts is going to be a lot less, and it will save the borough money. And that worked out quite well. I think you were sent some photographs at one point of what they look like now. Obviously they're not fully developed because it takes a few years for these things to come on. But because it went so well and we didn't really have any complaints from members of the public, nobody said that it was absolutely dreadful, we're into phase 2 now, where some additional roundabouts are also being planted in the same way. There was a list sent out and you all did have that email. That did prompt a couple of questions that came back, which I responded to people individually about. But that's where we are with it at the moment, doing additional roundabouts. Depending on how it goes, there may be other areas, not only roundabouts, but possibly amenity areas as well, where this can be phased yet again. But it's softly approach, because we don't want to upset the general public too much. See how it goes. It's just have to wait and see, really. But that's where we are. We're in phase 2. There could well be a phase 3, but we'll come to that next year.
Thank you very much for that, Margaret. Sorry to drop that on you tonight, but can I just say it also prompted some requests for other areas, not necessarily roundabouts, to be planted in a similar way. So I think we've had a very positive reaction to that. But does anybody have any specific questions at this moment, or shall we move on? No? Try that again. The last item on the agenda is the forward plan, and that plan, our next meeting, I'm certainly looking forward to hearing what we have from the Christchurch Town Centre parking strategy. I'm sure that's going to raise an awful lot of interest from residents as well as members, and the coastal strategy results of the community engagement events. So with that, I will say thank you very much, all of you, for attending tonight, the officers as well for the work you have done, and I'll close the meeting. Thank you.